The desert wind carried the scent of dust and wood smoke, whispering through the tattered boards of the old barn that had been turned into a shelter. The sun was slipping low, laying a gold haze across the horizon. Every shadow stretched long, as if watching from the earth itself. A woman knelt in that fading light, her hands trembling yet steady enough to press cloth against a stranger's chest. She had found him bleeding in the brush that afternoon, an arrow buried deep in his side, and though her every instinct told her to turn away, something stronger held her there. He was unconscious when she dragged him inside, heavy as stone and hot with fever, yet alive. And now, as she worked to keep his breath from fading, she could not shake the unease prickling along her spine. Whoever he was, danger clung to him like a second skin. The land in those times was not gentle. It was rough-hewn and unforgiving, where survival belonged only to those who carried iron in their belts or steel in their hearts. Stories traveled faster than riders' stories of raids, of outlaws who bled settlements dry, of Apaches whose war cries split the night like lightning. The woman had heard those tales around every campfire since childhood. Yet here before her lay a man whose face was drawn in pain, whose chest rose and fell shallowly under her touch. His skin bore the marks of long days under the sun, his muscles lined with scars that spoke of battles fought and endured. He looked nothing like the helpless one she'd nursed before, and though he lay wounded, he seemed carved from the very desert itself. She told herself she stayed only because no soul deserved to die alone. But as the hours passed, she knew it was not mercy alone that rooted her to the floor. Something about him pulled at her, an unspoken weight that made her wary yet unwilling to leave. His breaths were ragged, his lips cracked, his fever rising. She worked with what little she had, bandages torn from her dress, water fetched from a half-dry well. Every moment she paused, she imagined heavy boots or painted faces appearing at the door, searching for him or perhaps for her. Outside the night gathered, the coyotes already calling. The boards of the shelter creaked in protest with each gust of wind. She kept her lantern low, fearful the light would draw attention across the open plains. In those lonely hours, her thoughts wandered to the warnings she'd heard from travelers who passed through, men who spoke of warriors feared for their cunning, for their unrelenting vengeance. She could not push those warnings aside. For though the stranger's face was quiet in his pain, the markings across his chest told her more than he ever could. They were not the marks of any settler or soldier. They belonged to a people the frontier both feared and misunderstood. Once, his eyes fluttered open, dark and piercing, even through fever. For the briefest moment, their gazes locked, and it was as though the silence between them held 1,000 words. She whispered for him to stay still, that he was safe for now, though even as she said it, she was not sure she believed it herself. His lips parted as though to speak, but only a strained breath left him before he fell back into unconsciousness. She pulled the blanket over his chest, her heart drumming louder than the coyotes' cries. She thought of what might come with the dawn. If he lived, what then? Would he rise with gratitude or with anger? Would he see her as a savior or as a threat? And if others came looking for him, men with rifles or warriors with painted faces, what would they do when they found her bending over him in care? She pressed the bandage tighter, forcing her hands not to shake. Each drop of blood she wiped away seemed to bind her fate closer to his. The old barn seemed to breathe with them, the shadows bending and stretching as if listening. She knew enough about the land to understand that choices here were never small. Every act could alter the course of days, or end them in an instant. She had chosen to stay, to keep this stranger alive when she could have walked away. That choice, she sensed, would not go unanswered. The night grew deeper. Somewhere in the distance, a lone horse cried out, and the sound carried across the plains like a warning. She froze, cloth in hand, straining to hear beyond the wind. The man on the floor stirred faintly, as though he too felt the weight of that sound even in his sleep. She leaned closer, torn between fear and resolve. He was not just any wanderer, not just any wounded soul. The truth of who he was pressed closer with each passing moment, and though she did not yet know his name, she felt the gravity of it settling heavy in her chest. She looked at him once more, the lines of his face lit by the dim glow of the lantern. The stories she had heard whispered by traders and soldiers returned to her mind, sharper now. A feared Apache warrior, they had said, a man who could vanish into the desert like smoke, who struck fear in every patrol sent against him. And though her lips trembled to admit it even to herself, she knew with bone-deep certainty that it was he who now lay beneath her. Hands her breath caught as she pulled the blanket higher, her pulse thundering louder than the desert wind. She had bound herself to him, if only by bandages and water. And as the night stretched on, one truth became clear when dawn broke. Her life would no longer belong to the quiet days she once knew. For the first time, she wondered if saving him had been an act of mercy, the beginning of her undoing. The firelight flickered, and the barn door groaned against the wind as though someone had placed a hand against it. She swallowed hard, waiting, her heart caught between hope and fear. The stranger shifted, a low sound rising from his throat. His eyes opened again, sharper now, fixed on her with a weight that made her hand falter over the bandage. She froze, her breath shallow. In his gaze, she saw neither weakness nor thanks, only a warning. And then, the voice rough as stone, he whispered a word she did not understand, a word that made her blood run cold, as though the night itself had answered her fears. Would he live to rise at dawn? And if he did, would she regret ever laying her hands upon him? The desert held its silence, keeping its answer close. As the lantern flickered low, the barn door rattled again, and she thought for certain someone was outside. Her breath caught, and she pressed her hand against the wounded man's chest to steady herself more than him. The sound faded with the wind, leaving only the crackle of the lantern flame and the faint groans from the stranger on the floor. Still, she could not shake the feeling that eyes were on them, watching from the darkness beyond the boards. She whispered to herself that it was only the wind, but her voice sounded unconvincing, even in her own ears. The stranger's fever lingered, his body shifting with restless strength that told her he was not like the frail men she had nursed before. Every time his eyes opened, even just a sliver, she felt as if the whole barn was smaller, like he filled the space with his presence alone. She wanted to ask him who he was, where he came from, but the words stuck in her throat. It was better not to know, she thought, because knowing would make her more afraid of what might come looking for him. She dipped the cloth in the water again, brushing it across his forehead. The coolness seemed to settle him, and for a moment he stilled. Her hands moved with more certainty now, binding the wound tighter, keeping the blood from seeping too fast. Yet each scar she saw on his body told her of battles beyond her imagination. These were not marks of a farmer or a traveler. They were carved from war, deep and lasting, etched by enemies who had tried and failed to bring him down. Her mind drifted to the land outside the barn, the wide plains stretching far into a horizon that never seemed to end. She remembered the whispers she had grown up hearing in the settlement, whispers about raids where fires lit up the night sky, about riders who came silent and vanished before the soldiers even saddled their horses. The settlers called them shadows. Some said demons. But she knew better. These were men born of this land long before fences and wagons crossed it. Men who fought for their people with a fierceness settlers feared but could not understand. And now, one of them lay beneath her care. Breathing shallow but steady, a storm hidden in flesh. She wondered what had brought him to her. He could have fallen in battle, abandoned by his people, or maybe chased by soldiers until he collapsed in the brush. Each possibility weighed heavy on her because no matter the truth, it meant danger. If soldiers tracked him here, they would burn the barn down to smoke her out. If his people came, they might not see her kindness, only a woman tending to a fallen warrior. She felt trapped in a snare she hadn't seen until it had already closed around her. The stranger stirred again, his voice low, guttural, speaking words she didn't recognize. They carried a rhythm, rough but purposeful, like a chant or a vow. She leaned closer, catching fragments that sounded more like growls than speech. Then his eyes opened fully, burning dark and sharp despite his fever. He studied her face in silence, and she felt pinned under his gaze. "You should have left me," he rasped. The words broken but clear enough. Her heart hammered. She swallowed hard, answering before she thought better of it. I couldn't." His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across them as if he was testing her. Then he closed them again, his body sinking back into weakness. She pressed the cloth against his wound once more, though her hand trembled. Those words haunted her even after he fell silent. Perhaps he was right. Maybe leaving him would have been safer for both of them. The hours dragged, heavy with waiting. She found herself listening for hoofbeats in the distance, every creak of the barn sounding like footsteps. The lantern burned low, its light shrinking to a faint glow that painted the walls in long shadows. She dared not sleep, not with the uncertainty of who he was or who might come searching. Her thoughts wandered to her own past, to the hardships that had shaped her. She had grown up on the edges of the frontier, where every meal came from the sweat of hands and every night carried the risk of attack. She knew loss well enough, had buried kin in shallow graves by the river when sickness swept through, and had stood behind shuttered windows when riders passed too close. Survival had always meant caution, and yet here she was, risking it all for a man she barely knew. The stranger's breath steadied for a time, though the fever still clung to him. She studied his face, the strong lines of his jaw, the sternness, even in sleep. He looked nothing like the fearful stories told by soldiers or the settlers who cursed his people's name. He was human, as flesh and bone as any man she had ever known. And yet the air around him carried something different. Something that reminded her that he was not just another wounded soul. He was part of a story much larger than her own, a story that could crush her if she wasn't careful. When dawn's light began to creep through the cracks of the barn, she stiffened. The pale glow stretched across the floorboards, touching his body first, as if the sun itself sought to reveal who he was. She rose quietly and pushed the door open just enough to peer outside. The land was silent, painted in soft gold, the horizon stretching endless. No riders, no soldiers, no smoke. For now, they were alone. But silence could be as dangerous as noise. She stepped back inside, closing the door, her eyes fixed on him once more. His hand twitched at his side, his fingers curling as though gripping something unseen. She realized then that even in weakness, he was dangerous. The calm she had clung to through the night wavered. He would live. She could see that now. The fever would break, his strength would return, and when it did, what would become of her? Would he rise as her protector or as her captor? Would he vanish into the desert, leaving her with nothing but questions and the weight of having saved him? Or would others come, drawn by the bond of blood or by the hunt that had left him wounded in the first place? Her stomach tightened with fear, but also with something she couldn't name. A strange pull kept her at his side, the same pull that had stopped her from walking away when she found him. She told herself it was only compassion, only duty, but deep inside she knew it was more. The mystery of him bound her tighter than the bandages she had wrapped around his chest. As the light grew stronger, he stirred once again. His eyes opened, and this time they did not close. They locked on hers with a clarity that sent a shiver down her spine. He pushed against the ground as if to rise, his breath rough, his body trembling but determined. She reached to steady him, whispering that he must rest. But he shook his head. "Not safe here," he said. His voice firmer than before, though strained. Her heart leaped at his words, for they echoed her own unspoken fears. She asked him what danger he meant, but he did not answer. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the door, as though expecting it to burst open at any moment. His hand moved instinctively to his side, where a weapon might have been. But there was nothing there. The barn seemed to hold its breath with them, the quiet, heavy and suffocating. She felt the weight of choices pressing down whether to trust him, to flee with him, or to abandon him before the danger revealed itself. The sun rose higher, but instead of bringing peace, it only cast longer shadows. And in that uneasy light, she realized her life had already shifted. Whatever path lay ahead, it was no longer hers alone. The stranger's dark eyes burned with unspoken warning. His breath came slow but steady. He did not say who hunted him, nor did she ask again. Some truths, she felt, would change everything too soon. The door creaked once more in the morning wind, and she could not tell if it was only the breeze or the beginning of the storm that would decide both their fates. She kept watch through the second day, counting the breaths between his words and the small sounds that came from the plains. By noon, heat pressed against the roof like a hand, and even the flies moved slow. He sat propped against a beam with a blanket around his shoulders, the bandage tight and clean. He looked less like a dying man and more like something dangerous at rest. When he spoke, he chose each word with care, as if the wrong one might bring trouble to the door. "Riders followed," he said. "Not mine. Not soldiers. Different men." She asked if he meant outlaws. He weighed the word as if tasting dust. Then he nodded once. "They hunt for pay. They hunt anyone who does not belong." She felt the truth in that. The territory was full of men who fed on fear. They drifted from town to town and wore law like a mask when it suited them. They could hunt a warrior or a widow with the same cold aim. She tightened her grip on the water tin, thinking of the road from the river, the one that cut by the cottonwoods. If those men had come that way, they could be near. "Why do they want you?" she asked. "If you are not their quarrel." He looked toward the door. A message was carried. "Not to them. To my people." I took it. They waited on the ridge and shot. The message was lost. "They want what they do not understand." Her eyes dropped to the bandage. An arrow had ripped his side, not a bullet. That meant more than one hunt had crossed his path. Maybe soldiers, maybe scouts, maybe men who wanted a bounty. The land did not care who chased whom. It only watched. He asked for a knife. She hesitated and then placed a small one in his palm. He cut a strip from the blanket and tied his hair back. Even this simple act changed the air. His face sharpened. His gaze grew steady. He might still be sick, but there was purpose in his movements now. She tried to remind herself that she should be afraid of him, yet she found her fear bending toward the men who might come to the door. He said little of his people, but when he did, the barn seemed to fall quiet. He spoke of a winter fire that burned bright as the moon, of children who learned the ways of the river and the mountain, of elders who kept stories like maps. He spoke of raids only as defense, of ground taken and retaken. He did not boast. He did not plead. He told it plain, and the truth in his voice cut through the noise of rumor that she had carried for years. She thought of the traders who told wild tales to sell whiskey and rifles. She thought of soldiers who swore every attack was unprovoked. The world was not a clean ledger. It was a bowl tipped by whichever hand pushed hardest. By late day, clouds gathered on the far edge of the sky. Dry thunder rolled across the flats with a hollow tone. He said they should move before night. She argued that he was not ready. He looked at her with a kind of patient iron. "They do not sleep," he said. "They will circle back." She understood he meant the hunters. That made a new fear bloom in her. If men like that found the barn, they would not ask questions first. They would not believe a woman who said she had only helped a stranger. Kindness was a small defense out here. He taught her how to hide the trail. Use straw to brush their prints. Circle through the scrub and step on stones. Leave a false path that leads to the wash. His voice had the tone of someone used to passing knowledge from person to person. Not rushed, not gentle, but steady. She listened and did as he said, feeling a strange peace in the doing. It felt better than waiting. They left at dusk. He leaned on her shoulder at the start, then steadied himself with a broken fence post used as a staff. They crossed the yard and slipped into the draw behind the barn where the ground fell toward the creek bed. The light went copper, then gray. The sky flickered with far lightning, and the first cool breath of storm touched her face. They moved slow and careful. The open plain made both of them feel like a flame in a dark room. When they reached the creek bed, he stopped and turned. His head tilted the way a hawk listens. She held her breath. At first she heard nothing. Then a faint jingle came on the wind. Metal on leather. The sound of tack. "Riders. Down," he said, and they slid into the dry cut where the brush grew dense. He pushed a handful of sand over their footprints, then drew her toward a cottonwood with roots like claws. They settled in the shadow, pressed close to the cool earth. She could feel his breath against her shoulder, calm and measured. She tried to match it, but her own lungs felt tight. Two riders passed along the ridge, then a third. They did not talk. The lead man carried a long rifle across his lap. Their horses moved at an easy pace, like men who believed their work would wait up ahead. When they reached the barn, the lead rider raised his hand. The other two spread wide. Even from a distance, the motion sent a chill through her. It was a hunter's pattern. One took the door. One circled to the back. One watched the road. He touched her arm and motioned down the creek bed, away from the barn. They moved without sound, placing feet where he pointed, sliding under willow branches that brushed their backs. The wind picked up and rustled the leaves, muffling their passage. Behind them, a door creaked. A shout cut the air, sharp and short. Then nothing. She could not tell if nothing meant quiet search or quick harm. She kept her eyes on the ground and tried not to betray them both with one misstep. They traveled until full dark, till the storm broke and rain fell in hard slanted lines. The creek bed filled in patches and forced them up to higher ground. He chose a small rise with 3 stones and a dead mesquite on its crown. From there, the land ran open in every direction. No shelter from the rain, but no ambush either. He wrapped his blanket around them both and told her to face the wind. The rain stung her cheeks and washed the dust from her lips. In that cold dark, he told her more of the message he carried. Not all of it, only what he thought she should know. There was a treaty offered near the river, a meeting planned by people who wore fine coats and spoke of peace. But peace, he said, had many meanings. Some meant peace so their cattle could graze. Some meant peace so their people could rest. Others meant peace until spring, then war again. The message he carried named a place and a day when leaders would gather. If the wrong men learned it, they would fire guns from the shade of cottonwoods and claim surprise. He believed the hunters followed because someone had been paid to find any words passed. Hand to hand. She listened and felt the knot between fear and duty tighten. She had never seen a treaty. She had only heard the way men in town used the word like a promise wrapped in thorns. She thought of how this land ate promises and left only bones. Yet she also thought of the children he had spoken of. She thought of quiet nights where no hoofbeats broke sleep. If a message could matter, then this one did. They slept in turns. When she woke, the rain had passed, and a pale slice of moon was pushing through the cloud edge. He was already awake, watching the horizon. His fever had cooled, yet he held himself as if pain was a companion he knew well. He told her they would travel north at first light, skirting the low hills and staying clear of the trail. She asked where. He pointed toward a line of dark shapes in the far distance. High ground, he said. From there I can see who follows. From there, I can choose. She asked what choice he meant. He did not answer right away. At last, he said, to bring danger away from you, or to bring you through it. His words laid a new path in front of her. She could go back to the barn, hope the riders had moved on, pretend the day before had never happened, or she could go forward and accept that her life had already changed. The choice should have been hard. It was not. She looked at the land and then at him and knew that backing away would haunt her more than the road ahead. They set out at dawn. The hills rose slow and the soil turned red. Thin grass brushed their boots. Once they found a line of tracks that crossed their path, fresh. 3 horses shod, running light. He studied them and said the riders had not slept. She caught a whiff of cold ash on the wind and knew the barn was behind them, a black shell. She did not say it. He did not either. They both felt the same thing, like a door closed and locked. By mid-morning, they reached a ridge strewn with broken rock. He pointed to a fold in the land and said to wait there. He climbed the ridge alone, slow and controlled, keeping low when the ground opened. She stood with her back to the slope and tried to keep her eyes on 2 things at once, the path ahead and the path behind. When he returned, his face had gone still as a mask. He said the riders were miles off yet, but not far enough. He also said there was a small camp east of the ridge. A family of settlers with a wagon, a boy, a cow, a woman hanging laundry between 2 scrub trees. She felt a jolt of hope, and then the cold reminder that hope brought risk. If they went to the camp, they might find food and a chance to rest. They might also draw trouble to people who had no part in it. She asked if he would avoid them. He said he would, but the riders would not. Outlaws liked soft targets when hard ones slipped free. His jaw tightened. He said the camp should move, but he did not know how to warn them without lighting a fire of fear. They watched the camp from the second ridge as the day wore on. The boy fetched water. The woman kept glancing at the road, the way women do when they have learned to expect more bad news than good. The cow nosed the dry grass. The wagon had a cracked wheel braced by a stone. There was no man in sight. Perhaps he hunted. Perhaps he had gone to find help and had not returned. Danger was a thing you could see even when nothing moved. It hung in the air like heat. He told her she could go to them under a white cloth, ask for bread, leave a warning. He could not go. She understood why. The way the world was made, a warrior could bring fear even with empty hands. She tied a rag to a stick and walked out slow across the flat. The woman saw her and did not step back. She stood her ground with a washtub at her feet and a small pistol tucked into the band of her skirt. They spoke a few careful words. The woman's eyes went to the hills more than to her face. She gave bread and a skin of water and listened to the warning without surprise. She said they would hitch the cow to the wagon if they had to. She also said the wheel would not hold. When she returned to the ridge, he was already gathering what little they had. He said they could not leave the camp to face the riders alone, yet they could not fight with two bodies and a thin knife. It was not his way to bring harm to people who did not seek it. That was the line that ran through his words, even when he did not shape them aloud. She felt the same line in herself. They set a plan that was more hope than strategy. He would draw the riders away and lead them into the dry wash north of the ridge where the ground broke in sudden drops. She would help the family pack and take the old cattle trail to the river bend. If all went right, the riders would follow him. If not, the trail would at least give the wagon a chance to move without shattering the wheel too soon. Neither plan felt safe. Both felt like the only choices the land offered. Before they split, he handed her a small bundle wrapped in leather. Inside lay a strip of bark with marks burned into it and a piece of polished bone. He said the bark held a sign that people of the river would know. If she reached them, she could show it and they would give help. He said the bone was from a deer taken in winter and had been carried by a child for good luck. The child had outgrown it. He had not outgrown the need to carry something soft in a hard world. She tucked the bundle close. He touched the bandage at his side and drew a slow breath. His mouth thinned with pain and then eased. He looked toward the camp and then toward the far wash. When he spoke, his voice had the tone of a vow. "I will come back to the river bend," he said. "If I do not, you must carry the sign to those who wait." She nodded. She did not ask what waited at the river, nor whom. The fewer words the wind carried, the better. He stepped away then, light on his feet even with the wound. He moved like a part of the land, not a man walking on it. She watched until he was a dark line against the pale stone and then gone. She hurried to the camp. The woman had already taken down the wash. The boy held the cow's rope with both hands and tried to look brave. Together they lifted what they could and tied the wagon tight. The wheel groaned but held. They started for the cattle trail, skirting rocks and dips in the ground. Dust rose in small puffs around their boots. The sun climbed and pressed heat into their backs. Each step felt like a bargain made with luck. Then from the west came the crack of a rifle. A second followed, then the sharp cry of a horse. The boy flinched. The woman gripped the wagon rail until her knuckles went white. She turned her face toward the sound, then toward the trail, torn between fear for the man who had warned them and the duty to keep her child moving. More shots rolled across the plain, spaced like drum beats. The cow balked and pulled hard. The wagon listed and creaked. The bad wheel shivered. Far off, a dust plume lifted and then broke apart. She could not tell who chased and who fled. They hurried the wagon into the cut of the cattle trail, where the ground dipped and offered cover. The track snaked between low banks and scrub. The air grew still and hot. In that close heat, every breath sounded loud. She felt the leather bundle press into her ribs as she leaned into the wagon. The marks on the bark seemed to warm against her skin like a living thing. Another shot snapped the silence. Then the sound died, replaced by the thud of hooves moving fast but not yet near. She pictured the warrior running the ridge and dropping into the wash, drawing the riders on. She pictured the narrow place where the ground fell and the way a horse might misstep in haste. Her mind pulled two ways at once. One way wished for the riders to fall back. The other feared the quiet that would come if they did. The trail bent north and then east toward the river bend he had named. The woman asked how much farther. She told her the truth. She did not know. The land kept its own measure. They would reach the bend when it allowed. Behind them, the dust plume rose again. Closer now, and a figure crested the ridge to the west, small as a finger against the sky, then vanished. The boy asked if that was a friend. No one answered. The wagon wheel squealed and caught. The cow tossed its head and stumbled. The woman murmured calm and pulled the rope smooth. They reached a fork where the trail split. One way led to the open river flats, quick but exposed. The other wound through a stand of cottonwoods and brush, slow but hidden. She looked up at the sky and felt for the wind. The breeze ran from north to south. Sound would carry to the flats. Dust would rise in clouds they could not hide. She pointed to the trees. They turned into the shade, and the light softened to green. The air smelled of damp earth. The cow's steps sounded heavy and real, rather than sharp and hollow. For a moment, the world felt kind. She wanted to believe the feeling. She held it as long as she could. Then a branch snapped ahead, quick and clean. A single footfall followed. Not animal. Human. Another step came, then a hush like a hand pressed over a mouth. She raised her hand and the wagon halted. The woman drew the small pistol without sound. The boy's eyes widened, but he kept his hold on the rope. From the brush stepped a man in a dusty coat with a star pinned, crooked on his chest. Behind him came two more, their faces lax with the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. They spread out across the trail as if they, too, had learned the hunter's pattern. The man with the star raised one palm in a friendly shape, but his other hand rested near the butt of his holstered gun. "Morning," he said. "We're trailing a thief who set a fire and ran. Seen anyone pass this way in a hurry?" Her heart went cold. She thought of the barn. She thought of smoke and the neat way lies can dress like truth. She held her breath and measured the small space between the cow, the wagon, the men, and the nearest tree. The leather bundle pressed harder into her ribs, as if it too knew the weight of choice. The man's smile did not change. The other two men drifted a little, just enough to make the trail feel narrow as a throat. Birds fell quiet in the cottonwoods. Far off thunder muttered over ground that was not yet done with storm. She kept her voice even. She said they were trying to reach the river bend before the wheel gave out. She said they had not seen anyone. The man with the star watched her face while she spoke and then looked past her toward the ridge, where dust still smeared the sky. He tapped the star on his chest with a careless finger, as if to remind them that badges could be bought and sold the same as anything else. "Thing about thieves," he said. "They're always near when trouble is near. We'll ride with you to the bend. Make sure you reach it safe." The offer was a lock, dressed like a key. She felt the air thin. If they walked with these men, they would carry danger into the bend. If they refused, the men would peel the truth from them, one slice at a time. She glanced at the woman and saw the same knowledge in her eyes. The cow snorted, and the wagon creaked. A gust stirred the trees and scattered light across gun middle. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a lone call rose like a hawk or a person imitating one. The men did not turn at once, but the one with the star narrowed his eyes and listened. She did not move. She waited for the next sound, for the next sign. For anything that would tell her which way the day would break, the man with the crooked star kept his hand near his holster. His smile stretched thin under the cottonwood shade. His two companions shifted, each step slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world to press the wagon in tight. The cow stamped and tossed its head, the boy's small hand straining against the rope. The woman beside the wagon raised her chin, though her pistol trembled faintly in her grip. The air felt heavy, thick with storms still lingering in the sky. Every sound magnified: the creak of leather, the nervous huff of the cow, the faint rustle of branches above. She could feel her heartbeat climbing into her throat. The hunters offered a ride with them sat like a trap laid open, plain enough for anyone with sense to see. She knew if she agreed, the family's chance of reaching the river bend would shrink to nothing. Yet refusing would spark suspicion, and suspicion could turn to violence faster than lightning split a tree. She wished for the warrior's presence, his steady eyes and quiet certainty. But he was somewhere beyond the ridge, drawing danger into his own path. His absence pressed down on her like a weight. The hawk's cry came again, faint but sharp, cutting across the hush of the cottonwoods. This time the men heard it, all three turning their heads toward the sound. Their bodies tightened with recognition, though none said a word. She knew in that moment the cry was no bird. It was a signal one meant for her, though the hunters mistook it for something else. The man with the star spat into the dirt, his expression hardening. "Reckon he's closer than we thought," he muttered, and motioned for the others to move forward. Panic surged through her, but she forced her breath steady. She stepped in front of the wagon, blocking their path. "We can manage the road ourselves. The river's not far." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "We don't need an escort." The man studied her, suspicion deepening in his eyes. His smile faded, replaced by something colder. "Funny thing," he said. "Folks who turn down help out here usually got reason to hide." He tipped his head toward the bundle tied at her waist, the leather pressing into her side. "Maybe you're carrying more than bread and water." Her hand tightened on the fabric, instinct urging her to step back, but before she could move, the boy cried out. Dust rose at the far end of the trail, faint but growing, the unmistakable cloud of fast-riding horses. The hunter's head snapped toward it, tension snapping like a wire pulled too tight. The man with the star cursed under his breath, then barked an order. His companions drew their rifles and turned toward the ridge. The boy tugged at his mother's skirt, fear plain in his wide eyes. The cow pulled harder at the rope, restless and frightened by the sudden charge of energy in the air. She knew they had only moments, and those moments would decide whether the family lived or not. The thunder of hooves carried closer, echoing through the cottonwoods. Shadows darted between the trees, swift and sure. She caught sight of one rider, then another, dark shapes blending with the land, moving like they belonged to it. Her heart leaped, for she recognized the rhythm of their movement. Not hunters, not soldiers. These were his people. The man with the star realized it too, his face blanching before twisting into fury. He shouted for his men to hold their ground, raising his pistol toward the trail. The settlers froze, caught between one danger and another. She stepped closer to the boy, pulling him behind her. Her eyes fixed on the path where the riders closed in. The ground shook with the force of their approach. Arrows whistled through the trees, striking the dirt near the hunter's boots. One man stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the ground. The other fired wildly into the brush, the shot echoing like a cannon blast in the tight space. The man with the star held his aim steady, his pistol pointed not at the riders, but at her. "Tell them to stand down," he hissed, his voice sharp and ragged, "or you'll be the first to fall." She froze, her breath caught in her chest. The riders drew nearer, their cries ringing like the wind itself. She felt the weight of the pistol aimed at her, and the bundle pressing against her ribs. The family cowered behind the wagon. The boy's small whimper muffled by his mother's hand, and then, through the storm of hooves and shouting, she saw him. The warrior stepped from the brush at the far side of the clearing, his figure tall and unwavering despite the bandage at his side. His eyes locked with hers for an instant, steady as stone, before turning to the man who held her in his sights. The world seemed to shrink to that moment, to the narrow space between trigger and release. Between life and death, the hunter's hand tightened on the pistol. But before he could fire, an arrow struck the tree beside him, splintering bark inches from his head. He flinched, his aim faltering, but his grip held. The riders encircled the clearing now, their presence a wall of power that pressed the hunters into a corner. Still, the man with the star sneered, refusing to yield, his finger twitching against the metal. The tension drew tighter than a bowstring. She stood rooted, every muscle taut, waiting for the explosion she knew was coming. Around her, the settlers clutched each other, their wagon creaking as the cow tugged against its harness. The riders' cries rose in unison, the storm of their presence shaking the air. The warrior stepped closer, his shadow falling across the dirt. "You are finished," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing like a command. But the man with the star only bared his teeth, defiance blazing in his eyes. "Not yet," he spat, and shifted his aim once more. The world seemed to hold its breath. The horses pawed the earth, the settlers clung to their wagon, and the air trembled with the weight of what would follow. Every choice, every path, every heartbeat had led to this single, fragile instant. And in that instant, she realized nothing would ever be the same again. The clearing felt like a powder keg ready to blow. The crooked star on the man's chest caught the dim light filtering through the cottonwoods. His pistol trembled only slightly as he tried to keep it steady. The riders formed a half circle around him, their bows drawn, their eyes hard as flint. The family clung to the wagon, the boy pressing his face into his mother's dress. The cow bellowed, sensing the fear in the air. For a heartbeat, all sound fell away except the pounding of blood in her ears. The warrior stood at the center of it all. Bandaged but unshaken, his gaze fixed on the man who had threatened her. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence alone seemed to carry the weight of the storm. She felt her breath ease even as the danger sharpened. It was as though he carried the land itself in his stance. The desert wind and the rolling hills gathered in his form. The man with the star sneered, though his eyes flickered with doubt. "You think arrows scare me?" he spat. His voice was loud, but she heard the crack in it, the thin thread holding his courage together. He jerked his pistol toward her again, his last gamble to regain control. One wrong move, and she falls. The warrior's voice came calm, low, and steady. "Then you will not live to see her fall." His words carried the truth of it. No boast, no threat, just certainty. Something shifted then. The riders tightened their circle, arrows aimed at every angle. The hunter's companions, less steady than their leader, wavered. One lowered his rifle, his eyes darting between the bows in the wagon. The other stepped back, fear breaking through the bravado. The crooked star man cursed under his breath, realizing he was no longer holding the ground. His pistol wavered, sweat running down his cheek, and in that single breath of weakness, the warrior moved. It was not the rush of a reckless man, but the precise step of someone who had walked this path many times before. His hand struck the barrel of the pistol, twisting it skyward as it fired. The shot tore into the canopy, birds exploding from the trees in a rush of wings. In the same motion, the warrior wrenched the gun free and flung it into the dirt. The riders closed in, swift and silent. The crooked star man was forced to his knees. His companions disarmed with practiced ease. The clearing fell still again, only the echo of the gunshot fading into the distance. The boy peeked from behind his mother's dress, wide-eyed. Watching as the threat unraveled before him, she felt her knees weaken, the weight of fear draining from her all at once. The warrior stood over the hunters, his breath steady, though sweat lined his brow. The bandage at his side was stained again, the effort reopening the wound, but he did not falter. He turned to her, his eyes softer now, and gave a small nod. She realized then that he had trusted her as much as she had trusted him. The riders bound the hunters with rawhide, their faces unreadable as they worked. No one spoke of what would be done with them, but the answer hung heavy in the air. Out here, justice was not written in paper or courts. It was written in survival, in the balance of harm done and lives spared. She did not ask, for some truths were not hers to shape. Instead, she turned to the settlers. The woman still held her small pistol, though her grip had loosened. She lowered it now, her shoulders sagging with relief. The boy clutched the rope of the cow, his face pale but unbroken. Their wagon still stood, though the wheel creaked with every shift. She helped them gather what had spilled, passing bread in small bundles back into the wagon. For a moment, the simple act of stacking supplies felt like the most important thing in the world. When the riders finished, the warrior stepped closer to her. His gaze held hers, unreadable yet full of weight. He reached into his pouch and drew out the strip of bark she still carried, the one marked with signs she did not understand. He pressed it into her palm again, closing her fingers over it. "You carried this when I could not," he said. "That is not forgotten." His words carried more than thanks. They carried promise. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The riders prepared to move, guiding their horses with quiet hands. The warrior spoke to them in his tongue, words rolling low and sure, and they answered with nods. He turned to the settlers, telling them to follow the trail east, where the river bent wide. There they would find safer ground, away from the hunter's path. The woman bowed her head, gratitude heavy in her eyes, though no words seemed enough. As the sun dipped lower, they set out. The wagon creaked forward, the boy walking beside it, clutching the cow's rope with renewed determination. The riders melted into the land, their presence both shield and shadow. The warrior walked at her side, slower than before, the strain of his wound pressing against him. She reached to steady him, but he waved her hand away gently. His pride was as much a part of him as his strength. They moved through the cottonwoods, the air cooling as night approached. The land stretched before them, vast and unbroken, the sky painted in deep hues of red and gold. She thought of all that had passed the barn burned to ash, the hunter's trap. The moment when a single choice had drawn her into a story larger than her own. At the river bend, they stopped. The settlers prepared their small camp, the boy gathering sticks, the woman tending the cow. The riders formed a loose ring, their watchful eyes scanning the horizon. The warrior sat on a stone, his hand pressed to his side, his face calm despite the pain. She knelt beside him, unwrapping the bandage, cleaning the wound once more. Her hands no longer trembled. She had done this before, and she would do it again if needed. When she finished, he caught her wrist lightly, his grip neither forceful nor weak. "You stayed when you could have left," he said. His gaze held hers, dark and steady. "That changes the path." She felt the truth of his words, though she could not yet see where the path would lead. The land was wide, its stories endless. She had become part of one she had never expected. Night settled, the stars appearing one by one, sharp and bright against the dark sky. The settlers lay close to their wagon, the boy already asleep, the woman staring into the flames. The riders murmured among themselves, their voices blending with the sound of the river. The warrior remained near her, silent, his presence a steady anchor. She thought then of what she had learned, that fear was not the whole of a man, that stories told by strangers never carried the full truth, that sometimes helping a single person meant changing more lives than you could count. She had not set out to join a conflict, yet here she was, holding the weight of it in her hands. The crooked starman and his fellows were gone, taken by the riders into the night. Their fate remained unspoken, but she knew the land gave little mercy to those who preyed on others. The settlers would reach safer ground, their wagon pulled by the stubborn strength of a cow and a boy who had grown braver in a single day, and the warrior he would carry his message to the place where it needed to be heard, whether through his own steps or hers if fate chose differently. As the firelight flickered across his face, she realized she would never forget this crossing of paths. He was more than a feared Apache warrior. He was a man who had trusted her when he had no reason, who had fought not only for himself, but for those who could not stand against the storm. The night deepened. The fire crackled, and the river flowed steady as time itself. She leaned back against the earth, staring at the stars, feeling both smaller and stronger than she had ever known. The road ahead remained uncertain, yet she no longer feared it. She had walked through fire and shadow and found her own strength waiting on the other side when dawn came. Painting the horizon in pale light, she rose with the others, ready to move once more. The warrior stood tall, his wound bound, his eyes on the distance. He did not speak of where their paths would part, but she knew it was near. Still, she also knew the memory of this journey would remain, etched into the land like the tracks of horses in dry soil. She touched the strip of bark one last time. The marks burned deep into its surface. It was not hers to keep, yet its weight reminded her of everything she had carried and everything she had survived. She placed it back in his hand, closing his fingers over it just as he had done with hers. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. The settler's wagon creaked forward. The riders fanned out ahead, and the river bent toward new ground. The warrior walked beside them a while longer, his figure steady against the rising sun. Then, as the trail split, he turned, his path diverging from theirs, his silhouette growing smaller against the wide horizon. She watched him go, her chest tight, but her spirit lifted. For though their paths had parted, she knew the bond formed in fear, and fire would not fade. It would remain as much a part of the land as the river, the hills, and the endless sky.